But in this one today, we're really focusing on the idea that we live with a fantasy. We live in a fantasy about the future, about the past, about the relationships we're in, about the relationships we want, and about the relationships we've been in, even about ourselves. So the idea of a fantasy is pretty universal. We've all had one, at least. It usually shows up when we have like a crush on someone. And so we start to make up things about them, like how great they are and what it'll be like when they like us, and what it'll be like when they're into us and we're into them. And a lot of times people fantasize about the kissing, the romantic or physical element of it. And then when it really happens, it isn't often what they thought it would be, you know? And even worse, sometimes they don't even want that with us. And so we get a little more obsessed with it and try to change their mind. So fantasy showing up is a pretty common thing for us. But when we're dealing with codependency, we have a very specific type of fantasy going on. And this fantasy is related to the consumer-supply relationship that's going on in the background. The consumer-supply relationship is the invisible relationship that you're enduring with the toxic, emotionally unavailable, or narcissistic individual. Basically, it's this. The narcissist, or the toxic, unavailable person, is the consumer. They are taking everything that you give them. What are you giving them? You, as the supplier, are giving them some form of supply. That could be affection, money, time, sex, a place to live, tolerance. You could be protecting them from consequences. You could inflate their ego and their sense of image and identity. But you play a vital role for their sense of well-being, because ultimately you regulate their life and they go off and do whatever they want. So in these kinds of relationships, there's only really one person in it, and that's the consumer. And that creates an enormous amount of pain for the supplier, because the supplier is actually coming from a desire to connect emotionally with the consumer. The consumer doesn't give a shit. They want their supply, right? So they're technically in what's called a utility-based mindset. You're their utility. You're supplying them with what they want. That's it. So they get what they want. They're happy. They don't really care what happens after that. Now, you want connection. That means you want reciprocation. You want to be understood. You want to be seen. You want to be valued, right? But you're not getting that. Instead, you're getting, you get a little of that at first. You get that in what's called the love bombing phase, where they idealize you and you feel like euphoric, like, oh my word, they love me, they see me. Finally, someone cares about me. Someone's going to love me the way I've always wanted. This is where that fantasy starts to develop. But eventually, the consumer starts getting tired of what you want from them, and they start to devalue you. And that's the next step in this journey. And so they start criticizing you, they start ignoring you, they start nitpicking at you. They might even get very verbal and aggressive with you. And what this does is it kicks us into the negative aspect of the fantasy, where we internalize this messaging and make ourselves feel really shameful, unlovable, unworthy. And what we do is we try to become more ideal for the consumer in hopes that they'll keep us and that they'll give us that love back that we first experienced with them in the beginning of this cycle. Eventually, the consumer gets tired of us and discards us. And in this event of being discarded by the consumer, we feel utterly gutted, and it robs us of our identity, our sense of value, and our sense of connection. The fantasy we create, called the codependency fantasy, or codependent fantasy, is trying to help us survive this kind of experience by idealizing the supply, by minimizing their bad behavior, the pain that we feel with them, and maximizing the joy, those little moments of joy we get with them. And it is just moments of joy, right? At the beginning, it feels like this massive onslaught, like we are drowning in all of this love bombing. But it gets worse, because eventually they stop giving it to us, and then it's done. It dries up, and we begin to wonder what we did wrong. Is there something wrong with us? Did we do something? What's going on here? What's happening? And this starts to interfere with our sense of security in the relationship, so we amp up giving them supply, which maintains that cycle, right? Well, it also amplifies the codependent fantasy because sometimes we succeed in making them feel better and then they give us a breadcrumb of love, and that gives us a big high, a chemical high there, and that's called trauma bonding. And those little moments where we get what we want from them, that's called intermittent reinforcement. And this is the fuel of the codependent fantasy, where they change just for a little while, and so we begin to believe in a delusion that we can change other people, and that if he would just let our love in, he would heal, and he wouldn't need to be this way anymore, and he'd finally love us and see us for who we are. Because part of the fantasy is, I can see what a good person they could be if they would just XYZ. That's what keeps us hooked, is we have this hope because we believe we can see who they could be, and that's bullcrap, guys. We can't see what they're going to be. We don't have that kind of clairvoyance. We're not that. We're not godlike in that respect. No, what's really going on is we are creating a fantasy of what we want them to be, so we don't have to face the reality of what's really going on. Okay? And what's really actually going on is not just the terrible treatment we're receiving from them, but it's the denial of our own feelings. It's the denial of our value and our sense of worth. It's about our fear of being alone and being rejected and being independent of this person. It's our fear that we're really not worth loving, knowing, and keeping. We really wrestle with that because we have a fantasy about ourselves too. And that fantasy is that we're not worth it. That there's something so innately wrong with us that nobody would really love us. Nobody would really want to keep us. Nobody would really care about us. And that is a fantasy we have to focus on and address so that we can understand what truth is. Because if you're to really move beyond codependency, if you're going to move beyond your addiction to the narcissistic validation, you have to connect back to you and become a witness of your own value. That's the key here. The codependent fantasy is completely dependent on our illusion that we have no value. Reality is we have immense value and worth. It's not determined, though, by our output. It's determined by our existence. It's called the appreciation of existence. That's where our value is rooted. So I am pull up my notes to make sure I am still on target with us here today. So now that the fantasy has some very important uses for us. One, it helps us tolerate the toxic reality that we're in, but it also perpetuates that reality. So we have to become willing to hear ourselves when we're dealing with this kind of fantasy. And what are we going to be listening to or listening for? We're going to be listening for the pain. Because ironically and a little paradoxically, the pain, the thing we're trying to avoid by using the fantasy, is also the solution to the fantasy, because the pain is actually connected to the reality of what we're going through. And so healing is backwards that way. It's not about getting rid of pain at first. It's actually about acknowledging the pain, validating and legitimizing our experience, and that begins to break the chains that we've put ourselves in with this codependent fantasy. If you're really interested in having healthy relationships, we have to identify the fantasies we're living in so that we can exit them and move towards having a cohesive, integrated, loving experience with real people. And that's one of the biggest challenges we face in this, is to actually get to know someone, to abandon the fantasy our brain wants to create about them so we feel safe and in control, and actually connect with them in a vulnerable, open state. And we can get there and make that actually quite easy if we resolve the underlying issues that cause the fantasy. Tomorrow I'm going to talk more about those rooted issues and how we address them. But today I really want to ask you this question. I want you to think about this. What fantasy are you living in? Is the relationship that you're in a fantasy? And I've got some questions that can help you determine that. So question number 1, do you believe in the best person, like the best person they could be regardless of their terrible behaviors? Do you believe that they'll change into something else? Even though you've brought it up, you've tried therapy, you've tried to correct things, you've talked to them about it, and nothing changes? Because if you keep believing that they're going to change when they're not changing consistently, you're dealing with a fantasy. Are you in denial about your own feelings, about how you've been treated, and how you feel about it, and how you treat yourself? That's a big one right there. Because we ignore ourselves, we deny ourselves, and we deny what they're doing too. Are you in denial, or are you ignoring the very real mental and physical, financial, emotional cost that this relationship's putting you through? Yeah, because healthy relationships have a different kind of cost. They actually have a cost that is seen as an investment that has a return to it, where it adds to your life. It expands you. You feel empowered to be you more. It strengthens your sense of self. It connects you with you. Narcissistic systems absorb each other and then consume each other and then discard each other. That leaves you empty. That leaves you in pain. That leaves you confused and lost. And you've got to get honest with yourself about what's really going on there if you're to actually break through this. Okay? Now, do you think that things will get better if you try harder? Because that's one of the big ones that come with this. If you do, then you're dealing with a fantasy and you need to get sober with it. I'm going to show you how to do that tomorrow. Oh, hi, Angela. And Angela says, it's difficult to trust someone else that it's a delusion when my own feelings say it's something more. Yeah, don't believe your feelings. Believe behaviors. Believe patterns of behavior, because feelings are easily manipulated, especially when we don't have a rooted sense of self. Then we're not going to know what our feelings are. We're going to know what our programmed feelings are. And so we have to look at behaviors, and we have to look at what really those behaviors feel like, because we have euphoric feelings that come up all the time, and that's the love addiction, that's the trauma bonding talking, and none of that's truth. What's true is when he does this, it really hurts. I'm really scared when I'm around him. My body is in tension with him, and I'm kind of zoning out. You're dealing with trauma bond. You're dealing with love addiction there. So you can't have a healthy relationship with a person that's unhealthy, period. It's like you can't be healthy drinking a little Drano every day. It's not going to work. That's the delusion. You can't have a healthy experience with someone who's not healthy. They're not compatible. They do not function that way. It doesn't matter if the person may be more than a label, Angela, but you're justifying being in the relationship with this. You're literally saying you're in a fantasy right there by saying, well, they're more than a label. Yeah, and you are too. You have to stand up for you. You have to find within you your true value and go, oh, I don't deserve this treatment, and I can be treated better. I can find love that loves me. See, you're attached to that person being the person you need them to be, rather than acknowledging what they choose to be, actually learning to respect that and go, yeah, you choose to treat people really poorly. I'm out. That's what healthy people do. This is not, you're not abandoning them. You're not responsible for their well-being. They're a grown-ass adult. They can do their own job, honestly. Narcissists get into the codependent mind and convince the codependent that the narcissist needs them because they're so weak, or there's some sort of attribute they have that only the codependent could fix for them. And that's part of the delusion they get us into. So yeah, they're more than a person, but it really becomes irrelevant when being with that person costs you your happiness and your well-being, your sanity, and your health. No relationship, no person is worth that. So you got to make some decisions about your own value, your own well-being there. So that's part of the fantasy. We convince ourselves, wow, they're more than what they're doing, sure, but are they actually showing up that way? Or are you just trying to justify why you're there? I mean, just to be really, really blunt there. All right. So, another thing to think about is, do you believe their promises over their consistent behavior? Because do they promise that they'll get better? Do they say sorry but nothing changes? Do they promise to go to therapy but they never do? Or when they do, they always turn it on you? You're always the person that's the problem. They're always a victim of something. Yeah. And in all this, are you denying your own goodness, your own worthiness, your own value? Because you probably are. Because you're not even honoring your pain. Your pain's there to guide you. It's there to wake you up and go, this isn't good for us. Let's stop. Can we stop? Can this end? Yeah. Relationships aren't there to hurt us. Healthy relationships empower and help us grow. And that's the truth of it. It may suck to hear. I get it. I've had to go through it a few times myself. I lost my parents because of this. Okay? I lost friendships and belief systems because of these realizations. I lived alone, like emotionally alone, for years until I was able to heal and put things back together and reconnect and build real relationships that worked for me. Okay? So, yeah, there's a cost. It's a hard journey to acknowledge that, wow, this person isn't what I needed them to be. They aren't who they say they are. And this is really hurting my life. It's hard. It's heartbreaking. It's discouraging. It's scary. And it's an honest moment. Because then we can start saying, what do I need to change? Am I willing to really connect with my own value? Am I willing to take a risk for me? Because, I've been at this, guys, for 11 years. And I have clients that came to me, when they first came to me, they didn't believe real love even was a real thing, where they could be loved for who they are, where their feelings their feelings, their desires, their person, their well-being would matter to somebody else. And with the processes that I teach, the trainings I put them through, they discovered that as a fact for them, that it was real. Several of them, numerous of them, one just got married a few months ago. Another one is getting married here in a few months. They didn't think they'd ever find that again. They never thought they would actually be loved for who they are, but now they're experiencing it. That's how this works. But they had to make that big, scary leap to admit what's really going on and to admit how they're perpetuating it with their fantasy. So I want you to think about today, guys. Are you living in a fantasy? Are you ignoring abusive behavior? Are you ignoring being denied your needs? Criticism? Are you ignoring being replaced by the dog or the car or work? Because loving people want you in their life. They're going to pay attention to you. They're going to include you. They're going to value you. They're going to care about how you feel. Is that happening in your relationship on a consistent and reliable basis? If you say no, if your gut's like, nope, that's not happening, you need to listen to that. Because your gut's smarter than your programming. Okay? Tomorrow we're going to talk about some of the root elements in play around the fantasy that we need to address in order to break it down and to start getting sober, getting connected back to reality. How we can stop justifying the other person and their behavior and start legitimizing our own experience. And we can stop rescuing and fixing and start holding accountable that person if it's safe to do. But most of all, to ourselves, we need to stop playing in this game and go, yeah, something is very, very wrong. Now I need to start making decisions that favor my own happiness, my own well-being. At a minimum, your well-being. That should be the basic floor for everybody, your well-being. Because if we really respect our well-being, we're not going to make choices that put us in these situations. We're going to run like hell from them. Because we're not responsible for fixing other people. They're adults. They're not children. They're fully capable of taking care of themselves. Let them take care of themselves or not. That's kind of the trick here. I'll bring up that fantasy too tomorrow, where we think other people need us that way, and they don't. We don't need to be needed. We need to be loved. So I will talk tomorrow more on that. If you're ready to break free of your codependency, you're ready to break free of that fantasy and actually rediscover your own happiness, your own self again, and then take my master class at workshop2.freetheself.com. It's linked above. If you're on Facebook, it's linked below if you're on YouTube. And thank you guys for being here. Remember, you're worth knowing, loving, and keeping. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good night.